Okay, Michelle, the main reason why I got in touch with you and Social Justice Ireland about doing an interview today is to talk about your Sustainable Development Progress Index you released at your seminar last week. Before we talk about those, could you give us a bit of an update on your work in general in Ireland over the last few months?
Yeah, absolutely. So Social Justice Ireland, our website is socialjustice.ie, and we're an independent think tank and justice advocacy organisation. So what we do is we provide independent social analysis and research and then evidence-based policy proposals. And I suppose the basis underpinning all of these is to create a sustainable future for every member of society, and with a focus obviously on the common good and those who are vulnerable. So in January this year we released our Social Justice Matters 2019, which is our annual socioeconomic review, looking at things from taxation to housing to rural development to overseas development to aid. It's available on our website. We just published the Sustainable Progress Index, as you mentioned, and we do a budget project every year as well. So in advance of the budget in June, we publish a budget choices briefing, which is a fully costed alternative budget, looking at what can be done within the parameters that government faces, but obviously taking a different approach. And then we produce an analysis and a response to government's budget every year as well. So I suppose those are just some of the things we do.
Okay. You mentioned the budget there.
Yeah.
I heard that the Minister for Employment Affairs and Social Protection, Regina Doherty, said in the last couple of months that in the next budget coming up, she plans to allocate funding so that school books are free, This is a great development, isn't it?
Yes, and there's been a long campaign around this, particularly from the St. Vincent de Paul. So if it does materialise in the coming budget, then that would be a huge, I suppose, relief to parents and to families and schools across the country. It would be a huge benefit to children and young people. I suppose it should be part of a broader policy of, increasing the amount of resources available to deaf schools and really looking at tackling educational disadvantage and supporting families, because not only is the cost of books, and so many schools have to ask for family contributions every year as well, because there were a lot of budget cuts to the running of schools, and providing those contributions is also another huge pressure on families. So that's another area that I know lots of organisations, in particular the Vincent de Paul as well, have been campaigning. So, if the free books are introduced in Budget 2020, then, that will be a really important step on the road to, really making our education system equitable for everybody.
I know that Barnardo's as well, they were very active on this for the last few years, weren't they? Yeah.
They have, yeah.
To talk about the SDGs, could you give us a bit of a summary into your annual Sustainable Development Progress Index that you bring out every year, and then tell us what you have learned in your most recent index?
Yeah, so basically we've published this every year. We started publishing it 3 years ago because the SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Goals, they were adopted by the UN in 2015, and then they came into force in January 2016, and Ireland, as a member of the United Nations, signed up for them. So the 17 goals, looking at things like no poverty, good health and well-being, decent work and economic growth, life on land, climate action, reduced inequalities, gender equality. So there's a variety of issues there, and what they do really is, I suppose, they provide us a social, environmental and economic scorecard that we can measure government policies against. And like, the Irish government has committed to these goals, and Minister Bruton now has committed to having every department put the relevant sustainable goal, at the heart of their policy making. So this year our index, so what we do is we assess Ireland's progress on each of the 17 goals, and then we also compare Ireland to the EU 15, so our peers and our neighbours who are at the same stage of development as us, so the EU 15, and what we find is that Ireland is placed 11th out of the European Union 15, which no change actually on last year, and unsurprisingly we don't perform very well at all on the environmental element. which is actually we get our lowest score there. We come 13th, but we do well in a couple of areas. We do well in terms of quality education, and I imagine if, as you mentioned, Minister Doherty brings in the free school book scheme, we might move up a ranking again on education next year. We do well on peace and justice and clean water, but we don't do well on things like reduced inequalities, affordable and clean energy, consumption production, responsible consumption and production, and climate action, for example. We perform very poorly.
And your seminar last week, that was to launch the index, was it?
Yes, so we launched it, and the index is on our website, but there's also a video of the seminar on our website as well. We live streamed it, so the video of the presentation of the index and the Q&A, and there was a response to the index from Coalition 2030 from Jennifer Thompson. So that's all available on our website for anybody who wants to go and have a look at that, and the document is there as well. So what I suppose the purpose of this is to highlight and to increase awareness around the goals themselves, and also that, you know, they're not just goals for developing countries, they're goals for every country, and they apply to us at a local level here in Ireland, at a national level, and obviously at a European and a global level too, and they impact on people's everyday lives. So it's to raise awareness and to also measure government progress as well on how we're doing.
I interviewed Robin Hannon from the European Anti-Poverty Network a few years ago, and I asked him how the recession was, in his personal opinion, and for his organisation. He said it was devastating. The recession in Ireland is officially over now. Do you want to just say something about like how you view Ireland today after us coming through the last global recession? Like, there is huge inequality in Ireland, isn't there?
There is still, and I suppose that's the real problem. And we highlighted this in our Social Justice Matters when it was launched. So it's about 10 years on from the beginning of the recession. Poverty levels are at the same rate now as they were 10 years ago, but the population is growing, so there's actually more people living in poverty. You have over 230,000 children in this country who are living in poverty. So to have over 15% of your population living in poverty when you have the fastest growing economy in Europe, and when you have had the fastest growing economy in Europe in the past number of years, what that tells us is that there was inequality in Ireland prior to the recession, and we have a really high level of what's called, I suppose, direct income inequality. So before our taxation and social welfare system kicked in, we actually have the highest rate of direct income inequality in Europe, and one of the highest rates in the OECD as a whole. And our tax and social welfare system actually does a really good job, because we bring our poverty rate down from almost 44% to 15. So without our tax and social welfare system, you'd have almost 44% of the population in this country living on an income below the poverty line. So what that shows is that market or direct income inequality is a real problem in Ireland, and we have never really implemented any policies to address that. So that what that shows is that a lot of people are surviving on very low wages, that we don't provide the services that people need, because when you look at the people who are living in poverty, almost over 70% of them aren't actually connected with the labour market. So a job is not going to move them out of poverty because they're not connected with the labour market in the first place. So you have to look at, what things do they need? They need things like access to decent healthcare, education, housing, public transport. All of those kind of things are what improve people's standard of living, and income is obviously a key part of that. And you hear a lot of commentary, I think, in this country that our social welfare system is far too generous, that social welfare rates are higher in Ireland, much higher in Ireland than in other comparable European countries, and that what we should be doing is encouraging people out into employment. But I mean, what that ignores is a number of things. Number one, the majority of people who are living in poverty aren't actually connected to the labour market, so the unemployed are only a small cohort of that. The second thing it ignores is that in most other countries in the European Union, or at least a significant proportion, when you lose your job, your social welfare payment is actually a percentage of your previous wage, whereas in Ireland, the social welfare payment is at the lowest rate. It's, the state rate, and it doesn't increase over time, and it stays at that level. And thirdly, there was a report today just published just before lunchtime by the European Commission, and it's the country report for Ireland in 2019. And what this report does is, it takes a look at the situation in Ireland from a number of different perspectives. Well, what I found really interesting this year is that the European Commission has noted that we have a really high level of income inequality before tax and transfers. And the other thing that they note, which I think is important coming from the European Commission, is that they say there are high levels of cash benefits in Ireland, but the reason for this is because we have a very low level of delivery of services in this country in terms of access to the services that people need, and that's at a high cost economy, and in general people have to pay for those services. So I think that's, an interesting and important development that, at the European Commission level, they're recognising this, and we need to do something about it. And you mentioned your interview with Robin, and, the recession was devastating for people in this country, but it's those people who lost out in the recession, particularly those on lowest incomes, and those who were already vulnerable prior to the recession. They're the ones who have lost out most, and they are the ones furthest away from the poverty line. They are living in poverty, and they're the ones who need investment in services and who really need to be targeted, because regardless of the outcome at the end of March, and if there is a negative outcome for Ireland in terms of Brexit, then it's those people who will lose out the most again.
Okay, Michelle, I hope to maybe come back to you closer to the budget to do another interview with you,
Absolutely, Darren.
Just to come towards the end of the interview, this programme is called Global Solidarity on Near FM. Just to talk about the SDGs again, what are you calling on the government to do?
Well, we have made a number of proposals for government in terms of the SDGs, both, I suppose, in an Irish context and an international context. So the first one is that GDP is not a suitable measure of progress. You need to look at social and environmental issues as well. So we would always promote a satellite or a shadow version of national accounts where things like degradation of nature, biodiversity, the level of homelessness, all of those things are taken into account, and they're seen as negatives. The second thing we would highlight on a more global level is that Ireland should be partnering with developing countries to support those countries to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, that we should be increasing our overseas development assistance. We've committed to have 0.07% of GNI, so we need to be moving to reach that perhaps more quickly than government would intend. We need to look at gender equality and balanced regional development. Policy coherence is a huge issue. Where on the one hand, we have government looking for consultation on Ireland's heritage to 2030 and biodiversity and various other issues. But on the other hand, we're pursuing agricultural policy of expansion, which are going to, destroy our biodiversity and parts of our natural heritage. So we need proper policy coherence at a national level. And we need to look at really integrating the Sustainable Development Goals, and that from the next budget should ensure that all policy initiatives are badged with the relevant Sustainable Development Goals, because they're relevant to us at all levels, local, national and global. So those would be among the recommendations we made to government in the report.